I guess I'm finally getting used to Captain Ron there. With me, once again, Captain Eric Larson. Yo, Eric. And our ace first officer, wingman, and chief technical officer. I get that right every week, I think, now. So anyway, Dieter Staudinger. Hey, Dieter. Dieter just slid in, literally, from baseball. If he stood up, we could see he's probably got dust on his pants there. So
I probably do, but for all of you people that are watching from Arizona, the team that I'm coaching is called the Ancaster Diamondbacks. So
yeah,
and our uniform look very much like the Arizona Diamondbacks, actually.
Yeah. So this is our weekly show for anybody who's afraid to fly, who knows somebody's afraid to fly, or if you just like to talk airplanes with us, you're welcome to join us. And we got the cast here tonight. We got we want to always mention, if you have not done it yet, a couple of things. One is to go over to our Facebook page and leave us a comment there. Let us know where you're watching from. That's always interesting. And then while you're over there, if you haven't joined our Fearless Flight Birds of a Feather Facebook group. And I think this is our 5th broadcast. We are now broadcasting live over Facebook and YouTube. Looking forward to getting the ability to have callers join us and live and ask questions live in there. But anyway, go over there to the Facebook or the Facebook Birds of a Feather group and join us there and leave a comment, ask questions, bring interesting things up that would help you and all the others over there like you overcome your fear of flying. Tonight we are going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about, I got my, let's see, I don't want to say panties in a knot. Well, let's see, what would be a nice one? I got all kind of irritated this week, and I don't normally get irritated by stuff in the news, but this week I let myself drift there. And the title of our little theme tonight is "If You Snooze," with I thought a clever way of talking about the news, you may lose. And the subtitle there, "Kill Your News Feed." What that means is there was an article, there's several articles this week in my news feed about, if you want to go to that next slide there, the captured one of the web pages there, and it talks about says Boeing has more problems than just faulty, or it says they have more problems than just their faulty wing parts. I think I got the other side confused with that. Anyway, we're going to talk about this one here. This is another thing that came out about the 737. It says that the FAA found some the evidence, and I think it came from Boeing. I'm not sure. You remember that explicitly, Eric?
Yeah, it did. In the process of inspecting the Maxes and to the great detail they go into doing that, they discovered there were some parts made by a subcontractor that were not up to spec, and the parts they're discussing and we were discussing were slat tracks. The slats being leading edge slats being outboard of the engine. 4 of them per side on the 800 series, 900 series, and the Max. And they said they found, I think it was up to 148 of these tracks made by the subcontractor, not up to manufacturing spec, and some cracking in them that they found as an ancillary inspection while they were looking at the airplanes. And if people seize on that, these things would have been discovered, and I don't want to steal your thunder. I'm just going to take off on parts tracking and validation and all that. These things would have been discovered in the course of normal heavy inspections anyway, but the airplanes were so new, most of them hadn't gone through the number of cycles and time to have those heavy inspections, but they would have been detected. And,
right.
You probably want to tell them about the tracking and the validation. I won't go off on that there unless you want me to.
Yeah, well, we're both going to talk about the fact that this was pointed. This is evidence of the caution in the system working in aviation. These were all. This problem was learned about and isolated in advance of any problems, incidents, or accidents in the air, and that's what it's all about. And if you had this going for you in your automobile to the same extent that we do in aviation, again, we'd probably have fewer fatalities on the highways every year. And so what kind of gets me is the drama around this. And so you have to be careful when you look at the news. Obviously I can't tell you to stick your head in the sand and not worry about these things. But when you do, you need to have somebody, you need to be informed before you can make an informed decision. And that's the problem with life and with the internet, and we live in an information era now. You can get a lot more information than you can inform yourself about. So we hope that you'll write us, me, Eric, or Dieter, and communicate with us, and we can hopefully give you some guidance on it. And in the process, you might even alert us to some things that we've missed out there. But go ahead.
I'm sorry. You should throw in, when we were talking about that earlier, the parts tracking and validation by the manufacturers and the FAA is so good that when they discovered this, they didn't have to go, oh no, we have to ground everything and go looking for these again. They knew exactly which airplanes they were on, where the airplanes were, how many cycles they'd had on them. And if there was a problem, they didn't have to go hunt for them. They knew exactly where they were because of the way they track parts. So they were able to go out and get after exactly the airplanes where these parts were installed. And that's point one. Point two, there hadn't been a fault or a failure or anything like that with those, yet they just detected that they were not up to manufacturing spec and had some cracks in them. And they're up to, I was counting with the leading edge slats, 4 per side outboard of the engine, then the leading edge flap inboard. So there's going to be 10 of these rails on each airplane, and there were 148 of these parts. So pretty thinly spread throughout the whole fleet. And even if there had been a failure of those causing a asymmetric leading edge slat problem, we have procedures in place to deal with that. So that would be extrapolating this way, way past where we would, but our clients and our fearful flyers with the great big brains on them would think that down to that point. Well, if it came to that point where there was an actual failure, there are procedures in place to deal with that, and we practice those. And this was caught before there was any such type of problem.
And if this had happened in a year ago, or 2 years into the future, or 5 years into the future, less likely in the future than in the past, but it wouldn't probably even make the news that it does today, because the 737 is in the news from the Maxes there. So again, you got to be careful about what you take in, because it can work on your anticipatory anxiety, and most of you don't need any help augmenting your anticipatory anxiety. As Eric mentioned, they identified 133 of the NGs. Those are the non-MAX airplanes, and 179 of the MAX planes, and they are, and in the U.S., only 32 of the 73 NGs and 33 of the Boeing Maxes are in the U.S. So that's a total of 65 airplanes that are here. But again, not really trying to impress you, but well, yeah, we are trying to impress you that that's what aviation's all about. It's about getting ahead of the staying ahead of the power curve, and doing things proactively. So
okay, guys, I just wanna if you could, whether it's you, Eric, or Ron, Albert, in chat just asked if you could explain again the cracks, or what had cracks or potentially could have cracks, and where on the aircraft it is, and and whether or not a failure would have been life-threatening or
So it's kind of convenient for us, because we've been talking about leading edge devices over the last couple of weeks. So those are, whoops, we had a failure, Eric.
If you wrecked that one, I got another one.
All right. All right. That's it. I'm going to glue it next week.
Did you reckon?
All right. So we mentioned we lost an engine. So.
Oh, that's bad news.
Yeah, we like to inspire confidence. Okay. So here's the airplane, and this is a 737 800, not the MAX version, but the 800. And Eric and I were talking last week about we have these leading edge devices along the leading edge, and that's what we're talking about. And what that does is it extends out and down for takeoff and landing. So it increases the surface area of the wing and the curvature of the wing, and allows us to take off and land at slower speeds. And so these devices have tracks. As a matter of fact, you can see on the trailing edge, there's some similar things, but they have a track that they're fastened to the airplane and fastened to the leading edge device, and they slide out and down on those tracks. And it's not the leading edge device that was suspect, it's the track itself. So it's the part that attaches it to the airplane. If one of those tracks had in fact failed on the airplane in flight when they were extended and it was loaded up, it would have allowed the airplane, the device, to somehow, possibly either fly off, but more likely it would have been attached, but it would have been deformed somewhat, like bent or something like that. And again, so even that would likely not have been a fatal flaw on that, but it would have certainly given them some flight characteristics that the pilots weren't used to, depending on whether it was out at the far end of the wing or closer in to the root of the wing. So that's where it's at. And the tracks are the faulty part. So what they'll do is they'll ground the airplane, pull it in, and take a look at those things. And then I think the other thing was, what is the problem? And the problem is it's things that you and I are not used to working with. It's more likely a flaw that was from some part of the manufacturing process. It could be what they noticed that the metal wasn't uniform in consistency, so that it might be subject to bending or a crack or something like that. We don't know exactly what the problem was, what they were worried about, but it didn't meet whatever the standard was. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to find out specifically what it was and give you more information there. But in any case, it's a flaw in the part itself. It made it subject to cracking, I believe is what it was. Oh, Eric's got his I
want to put my model up, and no, it is not crashing. I just wanted to show you what Ron was talking about on the top of the wing view. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 of these on this side, and 4 on the other side on the top of the wing going forward, and that's what he's describing.
Yeah, he's got a little bit bigger model there. So anyway, so I think that the question that was asked was, what is the problem, and where's it located and all that. So if you got another question for that, let us know. And I'll tell this quick little story that I told Eric. Now, I don't want you to panic, because I'm going to talk about an accident that happened and people died in this accident. It was way back in the 60s when we had jet engines that they put a propeller on, and it's called a turboprop engine. And I used to fly these airplanes when I was at my first airline, which is the original Frontier Airlines, okay? But this was before even my era in the airlines. And what had happened was, and this is what happens in manufacturing processes, the propellers are huge. I mean, each blade, there were 4 blades on the propeller, and each blade is about 7.5 feet long and about 18 inches at the widest part. I mean, these things are massive. It's impressive when you go out there and look at the size of a propeller like that. At least it was to me. The propeller's taller than I am. And what they would do when they manufactured the propeller is they would pull it out of the manufacturing process, and they would peen it. P-E-E-N, I think is how it's spelled. And that means that they would bang literally with a ball peen hammer. That's where the name comes from. And they hit the metal, and that makes metal stronger. Okay. Well, on I believe it was like 15 propeller blades, they pulled them out, and they wanted to do some special testing or something with that, and they never put them back in. Well, they put them back into the manufacturing process, but they put them back in after the process where they would have been peened. So they never got this peening process. And then sometime later, there's always harmonics and vibration on an airplane, particularly on a propeller. And in flight one time, one of these blades cracked and broke and separated, and it damaged the fuselage, and the airplane actually crashed. And so what we're talking about is the process that parts go through in manufacturing in airplanes. And again, this was 50 years ago now. And on propellers, which we don't have anymore, but similar things still take place where they track these things. And again, tragically, people died on that airplane crash, but from it we learn. And this is one of the things that I've talked about in the past. There's actually a concept called necessary fallibility, where we'll probably never get to where we won't have accidents as long as there are human beings involved. But when we do have accidents like this, what we learn from this has the effect of making much larger changes in areas that were not even directly related to the cause of a particular crash, and it makes us safer. And that's why airline flying is the safest way to travel on the planet. It's because of the energy and the investigation that we do when something happens to find out what happened, and to look at collateral issues. And I mentioned on previous broadcasts that on Sully's accident, there were like 35 recommendations. And of those, I think only about 5 were directly related to what brought that airplane down. And the others were collateral things that they learned from everything from the evacuation to some other things that they uncovered on that. And so that's how we get to be as safe as we are. So again, I'm not talking about something that happened recently. I'm talking about the process where a manufacturing process, they do certain things to the things. And this may have been, a similar process where it failed to meet some criteria, something like that. It'd be interesting to find out how they found it out. But again, the fact is that you want to remember is they did find it out. And as Eric pointed out, they not only found it out, but they had all kinds of specific information on which airplanes and which ones to look for and which ones are out of their operational everything. Okay,
Ron, before you move on, I wanted to remind you, two things, and the people might, per this discussion, not be aware of the huge role the FAA plays in parts tracking and checking for counterfeit parts and that kind of thing. And it's a big security and safety thing. That's a big part of their job. So that's this is one aspect of what we've been talking about. And Ron, I don't know if you want to go back to it. The deal you skipped over when you were talking about the news, when we were talking about that earlier, was news reports talking about the great percentage increase of the number of people dying in airplane crashes in 2018.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. I was going to do that last, but that's okay.
I'll leave it. I didn't know if you forgot it or whatever. No biggie.
No, I got that. I just didn't get the slide up there, the headline here, but we'll cover that. So what we want to do now, the slide that was just up there, we want to talk about this. This is another one, and this is what kind of got my ire up this week. And it says Boeing built deadly assumptions into the 737 MAX. The last one that we're going to talk about got my ire up. This is just an update on the 737 MAX. We're not going to beat it to death, but this is the latest on this. And what specifically happened there was Boeing asked and received permission to remove the MCAS. You remember the MCAS is the system that helps pilots prevent the airplane from pitching up and pitching down, and it automatically has an automatic system that was wired into the automation of the airplane that caused the stabilizer trim on the back of the airplane. I don't know if you maybe want to open this up to a screenshot there, Dieter, but this thing back on the back there. And it causes it to trim automatically if the computer detects that the airplane is pitching up a little bit or if it's pitching down, okay? And therein lies the problem. Well, the specific problem on that was, one was they the Boeing asked for and received permission to take that description out of the pilot operating handbook. And maybe just add a few words about that, Eric. You know, what's the handbook and the operating or the handbook?
Pilot operating handbook is the manual they give to us, the air crews, that gives us A, operating instructions, B, talks about all the systems, talks about how the systems are built and how they work, and what do they do. And the original, with the original design of the MCAS system, Boeing asked the FAA and got it, like Ron said, got approval to remove it because the operating window or operating parameters of the MCAS were thought to be so benign as to be undetectable, or as Boeing said, transparent to the pilot, and would activate at such rare times that it quote unquote was not worth mentioning.
Okay, and remember what we talked about. We talked about the fact that this airplane has been the original version of the 737 was certified back in the 1960s, 50 years ago. Okay, and so they would build them longer and put bigger engines on them, essentially. And in all those cases, there wasn't anything sophisticated, relatively speaking, that changed like MCAS. So they kept going. One change led to another, and we kept upgrading the airplane. Okay, until we got to this point, and this is critical. What Eric is saying is Boeing deemed this not what was the word you used, Eric?
Transparent.
Transparent. Okay, so they figured we as pilots, we didn't need to know the details about this because the airplane was essentially the same, and this was only supposed to operate, you know, under rare conditions. Okay, all right. So take it from there, Eric.
The pilots went out and were test flying the airplane under various sets of adverse conditions, the steep turns and roll-offs and wake turbulence and all that kind of thing, and they found that the handling was substandard on some steep banks, high angle of attack, that sort of thing. And so they went back in and said, well, guys, the engineers, this is not quite right. And the engineers and the software people said, okay, what we're going to do now is then change the parameters of the MCAS system, which they did. They greatly increased the operating authority of it.
And what that means is instead of getting just a little pitch up and down, they got a lot. And I mean, I think the time period was the main thing, right? It was a short burst of elevator change that made a dramatic change in what the pilots experienced flying the airplane. Okay.
And they also, for it to activate earlier, it had to have both acceleration, load parameter met, and angle of attack. And the redesign took out the angle of attack part, or took out the load part. So if it got the high angle of attack, the MCAS would just let loose. And they redesigned it and put that back in the airplane and said, okay, that's fixed, and that should take care of the handling situations that the test pilots were talking about. So they did that. However, when they did that, they didn't mention to the FAA that they had redesigned the operating envelope of the system that had been previously installed on the airplane, and that they had received permission to remove from the manuals. They just altered the operating parameters of the system.
So somebody made the call that the changes they made after the approval wasn't, didn't negate the approval that they'd already gotten. Okay, and therein is going to, and you've heard me talk about in past weeks, that's where the certification process broke down, and you're going to see that's going to be in the news. A lot easier to get the airplane fixed and flying again than it will be to get the certification process changed and all that. It'll be a lot more energy in that. So, okay.
Can I tell them my favorite two parts?
Yeah, go.
About the angle of attack vane. So when the pilots received their operating handbook, it had no mention of this. And the maintenance manual, the very detailed thing of every single nut and bolt on there, how does it work?
And let me just throw in there that the pilots the American pilots are the ones that have been in the news more, because they were the ones that were looking at this and realized that it wasn't in the manual. Just so when you hear the pilots complaining, this is what they were complaining about, what Eric's talking about. And
the maintenance guys only had a system description for the original system, not the modified system. So as we showed on earlier shows, the angle of attack indicator showing the airplane's angle of attack is what gives the system input as to when it may need to activate. And now it needs it from both indicators. It has to be what we call a dual channel operation, but that wasn't necessary at first. And my favorite stat that was thrown out of, I think it was an FAA database, showed since 1990, 1,172 instances of these AOA veins, angle of attack veins, being damaged. And the prime source of the damage was bird strikes or being smacked by the jetway because they're near the door and the nose, being hit by the jetway, or being hit by the catering truck. And my very most favorite one was, or the mechanics in a moment of weakness standing on them when they were working on the airplane, breaking them off.
And so, the thing about it, if that was the case, they would notice it if the pilots or the mechanics had broken it off. But again, just to kind of review, okay, what do you need to know about all this? Okay, what's been in the news is the fact that we have 2 airplanes that crashed. And initially, Boeing's response and the FAA, both the responses, was an underreaction. I think it's safe to say now. And they were making assumptions based on the fact that this airplane has been around for so long, or earlier versions of it. And they really under-evaluated or under-reacted to what was going on. And what Eric and I have tried to lay out right now was that it was approved. It met the certification process. So first and foremost, certification is something that's going to be looked at. They're not going to be able to rely. We talked about a little bit about the fox guarding the hen house, where because of a variety of reasons, one budgetary, one staffing, some of the certification approval processes have been literally handed off to Boeing employees who kind of wore 2 hats. One was a Boeing employee, and the other one was an FAA designee where they could certify it. Okay, so we had this problem that evolved, and I wish I could say that never happens and would never happen again, but it probably will. Okay, the good news is what ultimately happened, grounding the fleet and going and looking deeply about this. So now Eric just went into some more detail. What they found is it was certified and then modified afterwards by people. I'm sure they were well-meaning. And what happens sometimes in group process, you may know this from your own work, that in your office, it might not have the consequences of a Boeing 737 crashing, but you've probably been part of decisions where you said, you know what, the big boss needs to know about this. And somebody in below says, nah, it's okay. We're just doing the same thing that we've always done. All right. So that's what's going to come out of this. And like I said, it's going to affect the certification process. And then the specific things that went into this was something called an angle of attack vane. They're basically 2 little pieces of metal that stick out there, and they pivot. They're like a weather vane kind of, and they do a similar function, only they report to the computer on there. And one of the problems is Boeing only made one of them as equipment on the car, kind of like when you buy your car and they say, oh, you want wheels with your car. Well, that's an option. Okay. So they said, if you want 2 of these, which they'd always done in the past, they'd always had at least one replicated system like that when they had an instrument like that. And so now, and then they found out that there were reports of those vanes being subject to damage, like bird strikes and all that, which what that means is it made it even more important that everyone should have 2 of them. And now Boeing, that's a fix that's already in progress. When you buy if you and I want to buy a 737 MAX, we're going to get it in the price. It's going to come with 2 angle of attack vanes. You're going to say something, Eric.
I just think it's super important to add on, and you brush on it there. I absolutely believe in my heart of hearts there is zero nefarious sort of intent or execution by Boeing on this. They never would have brought this amount of pain on themselves knowingly. However, it demonstrates in the flow of the certification process, each team, the pilot team, the software guys, the engineer guys, the design guys, were kind of like cells, like in a spy cell where they're doing a piece and a piece and a piece. and not very many people had the whole picture of what was happening. And in the aftermath of the 2020 hindsight, even people involved in the design said, oh, I had no idea it would do that. Or these guys did this after we did this other thing. There wasn't any continuity. There wasn't any continuity of looking at the whole process, which will certainly be reviewed. So everybody has some idea of what the cause and effect is of what's going on with the design stuff. They did this in segments, and the people involved in it, many of them had no clue of what that effect would be on the end result.
And I like to bring up, one of the things that when I taught human factors to my peer pilots, it was a requirement every year to go through. We had an initial requirement to learn all about this topic, and then we had to go through recurrent every year. And one of the things that I used to tell the pilots is nothing. I think this is a quote from Covey. What was his first name? 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Stephen Covey, and he said, nothing breeds failure like success. You may know about a personal experience for yourself. You get in your car and you're a little bit more preoccupied. You've never had an accident, or if you've had one, it's way, way in your past. And then all of a sudden, you take your eyes off of the car in front of you one day, you're maybe thinking about something else, and hopefully it was a minor accident. But that's what happens to us as human beings. And if you look at the process in this Boeing 737, the way it evolved from initial certification 50 years ago up until the status of these accidents in the 737 MAX, you'll see some element of that. People, and it manifested in the ways that Eric talked about, where people may have there were people who did raise said, hey, this is a red flag for me, but they were overridden by people who said, hey, we've been doing this for a long time. And that's the biggest risk as human beings, not just in aviation, but in all walks of life. So the thing is, if I sound like I'm trying to convince you that aviation is safer than any other way to travel, it's because I am. Because it is. So we hope that you'll stick with that and remember that. Okay.
There's actually a bunch of questions that are in the chat, so I will I'll kind of address them. Just I think it's the easiest if I just go chronologically. Darren Manzer wants to know about flying in rain, specifically flying in a storm.
Okay.
What, as a pilot, what do you know if you know that there will be storms on the way? How do you prepare? And if you encounter like storm cells on your flight path, can you fly over it? Do you fly around it? What do you do in order to ensure that you get to your destination safely?
Okay.
Maybe Eric, that's a good question for you.
Yeah, take that, Eric, and I'm going to write down. We'll talk about that next week. We'll talk about navigating weather next week.
Darren, I'll give you the short version because I can be verbose and we could go for half an hour. But before we go, we see a lot of information from our dispatcher about where weather is. We have live radar inputs to our company iPads so we can see it. So we have a good idea of where we're going to turn, deviate, how we're going to get around it. We don't go through it. We pick either a soft area or go completely around it. And when we're up to altitude or climbing out, we can see it, and we can see stuff on the radar. And the basic manner, the very most basic manner the radar functions is it measures the returns we get on the radar are based on the water droplet size. The theory being that the bigger the mass of the water droplet, the more powerful the updraft it took to hold it up there. And that's the more powerful part of the storm. And if it's night or in the clouds, we use the radar to pick our way through the what we call the softest part of the storm, or where the lightest updrafts are, i.e. the smallest droplets, knowing or assuming we're going to get the least amount of violence there. And I think one of your last questions is, or you asked about the engine ingestion of water. If we can find it, I'll find this video of, I think it's a GE engine, of how much water you can blow through one of those engines with a fire hose and the engine will still run. It's an absolute mind-numbing amount of water that you can pump through an engine and it will run just fine. those are the bullet points, and we'll expand on that next week if you need us to.
Yeah,
and if you have a local news station and you live anywhere in the Midwest or the East where you're getting thunderstorms and stuff like that, you look at the local news that day and they'll show you a live radar report. We have that in the airplane. We have live radar in the airplane. So.
And okay, so before, there's a couple more questions, but I do want to give a huge shout out to Ryan Yates and his son Andrew and the class of, I'm gonna say, high school students. That just today made it over, or are on their way.
They're on their way. They're on their way. I think
right
they took
now,
off this
actually.
afternoon. Yeah.
To Madrid, Spain, and both Ryan and Andrew were students in the Cleared for Takeoff 201 class, the very same class that you see on the screen behind Ron there. And yeah, big shout out, and we're looking forward to pictures and also especially Andrew's experience, because he's been asking questions over the last couple of weeks here on the live show. Yeah. And I'm really excited for them. It's just such a great opportunity. And the next question that we got here is from Sarah Geiger. When flying over water, say from California to Hawaii, what are the options if something goes wrong halfway through the flight? And maybe there's even an anecdote or a story that that you could use as an example there. Eric, if you want to take that one.
2 options, Sarah. This is the easy answer. Keep going or turn around. And we'll expand on that later. And if you contact Ron, I would even talk to you about that personally. But airplanes going a long ways over water have their own special set of additional certifications called ETOPS, extended twin engine operation specifications that the airplanes have to comply with to fly over water. And the maintenance cycles are more restrictive. The inspections are more thorough. The airplane is just looked at constantly through a magnifying glass. But to answer your questions, that years ago, and I don't know when that twin engine thing came up, the airlines went to the FAA and said, hey, these things work all the time, mostly. And if we can fly 2-engine airplanes over water, we can save a lot of money doing that. And the engines are so reliable, we don't need 3 or 4-engine airplanes. And the FAA was forced to agree with them by statistics were in the airline's favor on that. So that is when this twin engine over water operation stuff was born. And the airplanes are certified to either 120, 180, or 207 minutes for operation on 1 engine. And so when they're filed over water, they have alternates. And in the case of Hawaii, it's real easy because there's only one of the volcanoes in front of you in Hilo or Honolulu or so on and so forth, or back on the coast of California. And you can make either one of those with 180 minutes or 3 hours of cruising time on 1 engine, and with various other anomalies. And of course, we're fueled to handle that sort of thing with other contingencies. And we watch the fuel consumption carefully, and we have what we call an equal time point, where the time to continue on equals the time to go back. And if we have a problem that requires us to divert prior to that point, we turn around and go back to the West Coast. And if we're past that point and we have a problem, then we're going to continue on to Hawaii for whatever shape we're in, because that is now the shortest alternate in point of time.
And all of the things that Eric has been talking about there is all pre-planned. Before he ever gets in the airplane, he knows what his equal time points are. He knows that if he's here, he turns around and goes back, or if he's beyond that, he keeps going straight ahead. And he's trained that. He's trained in that before, during the checkout in the airplane, on how to fly that. So it's not something we kind of have to guess like you think you would do, because you don't have any experience with that. It's something that we train for and we plan for it.
Okay, and thank you for answering those questions. One more, Heather Orr wants to know if, and I'm gonna put it to both of you guys, if there is an airplane that you would not get on, if you, is there any airplane you would not fly on? So I'm not exactly sure where the question is really coming from.
Well, in the past, people want to know, you know, of the airplanes that you could buy a ticket on today. You know, sometimes they'll phrase it, you know, what airlines would you not fly on, or would you think about? You know, and we're gonna do a special webinar coming up. Probably, I think we decided in the first week of July. We've got an expert on the statistics of how safe it is to fly. He is the author of the one that I use currently for first tier airlines. Those are airlines from the United States, Europe, the highly industrialized countries in the world, even China is in that group, Australia, New Zealand, among others. And your odds of dying in an airplane crash are 1 in 33.2 million. And we're going to save that for the first week in July. And you're going to know more than you ever wanted to know about what that means and how you can wrap your brain around that. But basically, you know, I've said this to people. There are airplanes in parts of the world that I would definitely think about extra long before I thought about it. And I'll just name some names. In the parts of the what was formerly the Soviet Union, there are places up in their internal airlines that operate over there I would think twice about before I did that. I would more likely ride the train than I would do that. But if you have any specific doubts about anything like that, give us a holler. But anybody that you can buy a ticket on in that first tier, your odds are way beyond it. You know, it used to be 1 in 11 million. That was the popular figure. Now it's up to 133.2 million. So, and I want to move on to close this with what really got my ire up today. It was in that area. Okay, so let's recognize that one of the heroes of the week. We had Wasana, a guy who sent me a bit of a message here, and she is on her way, or she has a picture here. She was in our November class last year, the one class that Eric and I thought nobody is going to get on an airplane in that afternoon, and Wasana was one. She happened to also win the distinction of being the person who has traveled the farthest to come to one of our 201 classes, which we have coming up again in July. And she came from Myrtle Beach, North Carolina, South Carolina. Can't remember which one it is.
I thought she said Florida, no?
She did, but it turned out it was Myrtle Beach that she was coming from, which is actually a little bit further. And so we have a picture of her in the airplane there. We trust her that it was on the way. And then there's out the window there, but she's on her way to Hawaii. And she said, "Hi, Cameron, it's Wasana from your class November. This is my first vacation and first real flight since your class last year. It has been 10 years since has flown. I couldn't thank you enough because if you have this chance to have this amazing vacation in Hawaii, and the next trip is Thailand, she's going back to visit family in Thailand. That's one of the things she was preparing for. And thanks for that thoughtful feedback, Wasana. So anyway, it's open to anybody. If you can get particularly if you can come to our 201 class, you won't regret it. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about was this whole notion. I didn't build a slide for it, but here's the headline was, "Flying has become more dangerous. Don't just blame Boeing." And what they did was they basically wrote an article that said, because we had this crash in October of last year with the first 737 MAX, and that's the only one they really discussed in the numbers, and then we have this one that they talked about, or the Ethiopian Air. So we have two crashes, and so obviously that skews the number of people who've died in airplane crashes, and you know it's very misleading. And you know, airplane accidents are make the news because they're rare and they're interesting. And this was it just struck me as a little bit exploitive. And I know that there are many of you out there, you know, you're going to read those headlines and you're going to park them away, and you're not going to dig into it. And maybe next week we'll put some slides up there to show how misleading that really is. If you look at that trend I just mentioned, the odds of dying in an airplane crash used to be 1 in 11 million, which was extraordinary, and now they're up to 1 in 33.2 million, which means you'd have to get on an airplane once a day, every day, for 90,000 years in order to achieve that level of risk. And so, don't buy into that stuff there. You know, if you see if you see an article or something in the news or the media, grab the URL, send it to Eric or I or Dieter, and we'll get you some information so that you can make an informed decision. And again, we've talked about a lot of things tonight. Sometimes it gets technical, and we don't expect you to remember that. But what we do hope that you remember is, I remember that Captain Ron and Captain Eric talked about that stuff, and that somebody has looked at it. Just because it popped up into my mind or it popped up in the news doesn't mean that you're at risk and nobody's thought about that before. On the contrary, that's why aviation is so safe, and that's why you can plan on flying as much as you want in your life, and you're going to be all right. So
you'd have to fly every day for how many years did you say?
90,000.
Nobody could eat airport food every day for 90,000 years. You couldn't live long enough to die in the airplane. You wouldn't make it.
You're going to die with that, well, way before that. So anyway, okay. Well, we've gone long tonight, and again, we want to thank you for this. Next week, I've written down, we're going to help me remember this, Eric. We're going to talk about navigating, how we actually do that. It should be kind of fun and interesting, because we'll actually get some radar snapshots. Maybe you can get one in flight this week if you get any weather out there, and you can give us a personal what for. Well, what I really like to do is show them when you look out the window, you know, when you're clear in between the clouds, and you can see a big buildup up there, and then look on the radar and see what it looks like. It's a really impressive way of I think embedding in a person's mind what it looks like when they see it out the window, and what it looks like to us, and how we can successfully navigate around it. So anyway, so we'll do that next week. Any last minute things, Dieter? Any open items that we should talk about other than the class coming up on July 20th?
No, I think everybody's happy with the answers that they received, and I think it's been a really informative show. Like, lots of things that people, you know, really appreciated hearing and learning about. So that's really good.
Okay.
You guys are going to stay on, right? Yeah,
what's that?
You guys are going to stay on, correct?
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in. And this is Captain Ron and Captain Eric and First Officer Dieter signing off. And we'll see you again next week. Thanks a lot and have a great week.
Good night.
All right. Good night, everybody.